All right. Welcome back to another episode of Scholastic Lutherans. I am joined by Euler's pupil to discuss Abraham Calov, his life, his works, and also Euler's pupil's efforts to translate the works of Abraham Calov. This is something I've been excited for a while because Calov to me is somebody who is much less known, at least today in modern thought, among American Lutherans. And this is something that we're bringing back, so to speak. We're translating him, and I think we're going to learn a lot. So, welcome to the show, Euler's pupil.
Hello, thank you for having me on here. As you can see, you can just call me Euler's pupil, or if that's too long to say, or you forget, just say pupil. I don't mind either way. Yeah, it's great to be with you here, and I'm great to very excited to talk about Kyle with you and his works and what he's kind of like he's really known for. You can say.
Yeah. So, with that in mind, let's just jump right into it if you're ready, unless you want to say anything else about yourself. It's up to you.
Okay. Okay. Let's see here. Um, I guess I do want to say I do have a background in math, so if anyone here wants to say like some sort of math joke, I'll probably understand it. So that's kind of nice. But besides that, you know, oh hi Samuel, how are you?
Doing good, man. What's up?
Doing pretty good. Doing pretty well.
Oh,
Yeah, yep.
thanks for joining. Continue what you were saying, though, Euler's pupil.
But yeah, if I have a math background. Um, so as I was saying before, like if you put a math joke, in chat, I'll probably understand it. And probably get a laugh. But yeah, I guess I think this is sort of like sort of relevant on like why I wanted to start translating Calov because one of the reasons I wanted to start translating Calov was actually like this is sort of like part of my personal testimony is that like as I was, let's say, I wanted to get more deeper into, let's say, Christianity and the different doctrines it has, right? I guess I was very like you can say like tempted to go east and be like EO because of, let's say, certain Eastern Orthodox apologists and like transcendental arguments and let's say, oh yeah, modal collapse, right? So that's where I was like really like focused in and like, okay, I want to like see how these things can be actually like sort of like answered or addressed. So that's kind of sort of like one of the reasons why I started translating Calov. So yeah. Oh, hi, Cameron.
Yeah, we got the council is here.
There you go. We decided to stop in a little bit late, but we're glad to be here.
Yeah, yeah.
True.
Glad to have everybody. Yeah, true, real. Um, so yeah, thanks for that. That's good to know. I think that will help people understand well what's your interest because we'll get to that in a bit. But anyway, can you give us a brief introduction to Kalov? His life, his thought, just everything surrounding him, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's see here. Calov. He was born in. Let me see. He was born in Morag, Poland, April 16, 1612. He got his master's at the University of Königsberg. He got like a PhD in theology at Rostock. He became a professor at Königsberg, later on, and then became a pastor in Danzig. And then like the really big thing, like very famous kind of controversy Calv has, whereas this other like sort of he's not really like a true Lutheran in a way, but like Calixtus, right? And he meets him in the colloquy of Thorn, like because it was a sort of like this sort of reunion council to sort of hopefully unite, the Reformed, the Catholics, the Lutherans as like one church, right? And we can heal the schism, right? That's kind of the big idea. Calixtus was very like like irenic and wanted like this unity. Calv was like, no, like don't like sell yourself short because of the don't compromise the truth just because of unity is kind of the big idea I got from that. And so because of that, he essentially has this big controversy with Calixtus and his followers in the next succeeding like years of his life. He becomes after he's a pastor in Nancy. He becomes like the professor and like professor primarius and the superintendent at the University of Wittenberg, and that's where he like lives until he dies in like I think was it 1686 around that time period. So that's kind of the time period where he's at. It's like I think correct me if I'm wrong. I believe this is like after the 100 years the big giant war in Europe, right? The Wars of Religion. I think it's not 100 Years of War. Is it the 50 Years of War?
30s.
Forget. 25 Years of War.
30s.
Yeah.
After the big wars of religion, right? After Gustav Adolphus, right? And we get, so in the next century, that's when the Calov is kind of like running around, critiquing everybody, right? And so yeah, that's kind of the main thing. Like he's that's what he's really known for now, like his big like controversies with Calixtus. Even though, to be fair, he actually he wrote he's very polemical, not just against Calixtus. That's just what he's most known for. But he's also known for his controversies with papists, the Reformed. I don't know if you guys might not know him, but I think it was his name. How do I pronounce it? Like Jacob Boehme. He's like this German mystic guy that becomes more influential in later German idealism, and also the Socinians. Because Calvin, this is okay. This is actually during his lifetime. What was Calvin's most famous work? It wasn't actually all of these his system or his philosophy or even his commentary. He's actually most famous for. It's actually his criticisms of the Socinians, because he has this really big sort of almost first principles critique of Socinianism he kind of wrote that everyone just loved. So yeah, so that's kind of sort of his life, sort of I guess sequentially what he did and sort of controversies he kind of got embroiled into. So any specific questions about that?
Do you guys have any? Samuel, Cameron? Well, I'll ask one. It's another one that has to do with this theological context. Were there any specific Lutheran figures that you know of that were influential on him? Because the timeline's kind of messed up in my head as to when Gerhard and Quenstedt and those guys were running around. I think Quenstedt was later, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, Quenstedt's he's what is it? He's sort of I feel like Quenstedt married one of Calov's either daughters. Is that right, Samuel? They're sort of related, but he's like a son-in-law to Calov. Quenstedt is at least. But yeah, no, in terms of Lutherans that are influential for Calov. Well, one of the things is Calov actually wanted to learn under Gerhard. I read before, but he wasn't able to because of it was some reasons I can't remember exactly, but he wasn't able to learn under Gerhard, which kind of bummed him out. So he learned philosophy, under was it, how do I pronounce his name? Mistelina or something like that. I'm sorry if I butcher his name. Right. So he learned, from these other Lutherans, in the, I guess, more of the eastern part of Germany. So that's actually kind of interesting because in terms of the environment that Calov grew in, right? He was in he grew up in Poland. So there's a lot of how do you say this, intermixing between different, let's say, denominations, let's say, of Christianity, or different sects of Christianity. I don't know how however you want to parse it, right? Because he was so he interacted with EOs, Eastern Orthodox people, Catholics, right? Some Reform guys, some of the Socinians, right? They had a big presence in Poland, so he had all this interaction, sort of in Poland, I guess previously. Sorry, I'm not answering your question. But I guess in terms of directly, probably Scharfarius. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He has this really big tome in logic. He was a professor of Wittenberg before first professor primarius of Wittenberg before Calov was. And let's see who else. And as well as I said before, Mistelina, in terms of who he learned under. I guess in terms of I guess that's as much as I know as let's say direct influence. I guess maybe more, let's say, indirect influence, right? As in terms of who he read, right? He read Gerhard, he read Schleber, right? You might not be familiar with Schleber, but he's actually kind of pretty important. And we could probably start talking on let's say start talking soon about different influences maybe on Calov. But Schleber was one of the big guys who he's considered essentially the Protestant Suarez of Germany in that time. So he's actually he's a pretty important, let's say, philosopher of that time. Even Vudius, who's a Reform guy, says oh yeah, Schleber is good, but like, he doesn't like Schubert because, there's some like maybe Lutheran stuff he might have said in there, like, Voutius might not have been like totally agreeable with, but like, in general, like, yeah, he says he's, good philosopher. But yeah, I guess in terms of other Lutherans, oh yeah, actually, this is actually kind of important. I didn't think about this, but now, yeah, no, he's actually very influenced by Martin Luther. Actually, Calov
Mhm.
was, because he read a lot of his works and like wanted to like sort of. He had this like he made this sort of like index where essentially like, oh yeah, if you want to learn about some theological topic, like Calov has like this index of like Luther's works where you can like to go and read this part of Luther's work that talks about this topic.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Any
Yeah,
questions
Oh
for
yeah,
you guys?
sorry if I'm not I start rambling. Try to reel me
No, no,
back
no. That's
later.
why we're here. I'm learning a lot from this.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, but I think you've already told us a little bit about Calov's influences and his context for a lot of his writings. But besides the fact that Calov was a Lutheran and that he was a scholastic, it would be pretty cool if you could tell us a little bit about what makes Calov unique as a figure within the broader period of Lutheran Orthodoxy, and what benefit or value you see in translating him today. So, what
Okay.
separates Calov as a figure of merit, maybe independently, just from the broader category that people are usually familiar with of the Lutheran Orthodox, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, I guess yeah. This is actually like this is a good question. I like this. So I feel like when reading Calov, at least, I feel like might sound like a somewhat controversial claim. At least maybe in the Lutheran tradition, he seems to be like the culmination of all of the scholastic philosophy that came before him, in a sense. So I know that's like a really big claim, right? Right, because I guess in the immediate like, so right so I mean, let's see here. Should I go in the immediate context or the latter context? Okay, I'll start in the beginning first, right? So
Sure.
you have like the high scholastics, right? You have Bonaventure, you have Aquinas, right? You have Henry of Ghent, you have Scotus, you have Occam, right? Karlov probably knew like, I mean, I guess people talk about it too. Like he knew like all these figures and like their philosophies, backwards and forwards. But even like I guess more recently, right? Because this is during the time when I think it's in the Catholics, the Romans call this, what is it? The period of second scholasticism. Am I right? Like where essentially you
Yeah,
have
the
like
Baroque scholasticism, right?
Oh
yeah,
yeah, is it
Baroque
Baroque? Yeah.
scholasticism. So essentially you have like the Jesuits, right? And with Suarez, Mendoza, Alvarez, Banez. So they start producing all these works, the Salmantines, the Combrasines, right? And they have like because they have this big controversy with De Auxiliis and stuff, and they start writing works. They start you have Cajetan, right? Like you have all of this philosophy from like the papist side, and they want to they're trying to revive this scholasticism that they kind of had in the Via Antiqua, right, with like Aquinas and Bonaventure. But it's not just also like the Romanists that are doing this. You also have like the Reformed also are developing very like massive systemic kind of philosophies. Like the biggest one I can think of is like Alsted, because he's essentially like Alsted's actually pretty important because he's like an important, let's say, interlocutor in terms of like the philosophy with like Calov's philosophy. Because Alsted is essentially like the climax of what's called like the Ramas tradition. So there's a guy named Petrus Ramas. He has this, he has disputes with like he didn't like how to say this. He really didn't like how like moderns kind of use Aristotle and like he has this certain way, okay, what logic should cover and stuff like that. But essentially like Alsted was was essentially a Ramis, but he also like took how do I say this? He took also inspiration from like even other scholastics as well. Like the biggest ones are like Raymond Lull and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think also Scotus a little bit. So like Lull is actually kind of interesting though, because no one like there's not a lot of how to say this like Lullites, right, or like followers of Lull in modern times, really, right? But he was,
Hmm.
I mean, it's interesting too because he's a saint, right, in the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, right?
Hmm.
So because of that, right, he has this like very like because part of the reason, right, is because there's actually like a lot of like pseudo Lullite works that's kind of like running around that's makes it look like, oh yeah, this is like all like very like magic mysticism that's probably not so good, but like but like no like so yeah, so essentially sorry, I'm starting to ramble again. But it's okay. So
Yeah.
short story short. Okay, you have you have different like Catholics during this time period. Let's say and before this time period, right before like Cajetan, Suarez, Mendoza, the Combrasines, and you have like Reformed folks. Like biggest one is Alcid, but not just Alcid. You have like guys like Keckerman,
Mhm.
Vudius, and you also have like Lutheran guys as well, like Schlieber. You have Martini, Shafarius, and I guess also I kind of forgot to mention him, but also like Zabarella. He's a papist, but he's also kind of important in this because like a lot of Lutheran philosophy later on is sort of out of the branch off of like we sort of follow Zabarella in terms of method, and this is kind of like in contrast to the followers of Ramus, who are
Yeah.
like like Ames or like Alstead. So essentially, like what happens, like with all of this kind of like philosophy kind of background and milieu kind of simmering about, is Calov kind of like sort of erects his own kind of like systematic philosophy that kind of like starts like has a very very strong how do you say well very like very strong emphasis, that's the right word, emphasis on like okay how we know things, like on the knowables, on the principles of knowing, and like on truth, like sort of like it's very Augustinian actually. The way if you, I can elaborate on that more, but like like if you read on Augustine's sort of like realization that God is truth, that's kind of sort of like part of like the direction like I feel like Calv is coming from. You take all of this, and Calv makes this very systematic philosophy that sort of like engages with all these thinkers in some ways, and but in a way that's like very independent, like this is maybe like very like maybe independent's not the right word, but maybe very original takes. So yeah,
Yeah, and I
sorry,
guess
you guys
a
can
question
go.
that I have. So if I could, try to summarize some of the things that you just laid out. So basically, we know that the 17th century was this period of Baroque scholasticism, wherein each faith tradition, whether it's the Papist or whether it's the Reformed or whether it's the Lutherans, are all producing men of great caliber, right? These theologians who are like writing these massive theological tomes with like very robust philosophical underpinnings. But would it be fair to say that what is unique about Calov, and this is a suspicion that I've had, is that what makes Calov distinct or noteworthy among the Lutheran Orthodox theologians is that he is almost a philosopher in its own right. Like, for instance, when I've read Quenstedt or when I've read Gerhard, they are certainly scholastic in method, and they utilize these Aristotelian philosophic categories. But I wouldn't call them like philosophers independently. Whereas with Calov, we see that he writes the entire Scripta Philosophica, like he has entire philosophical works that are not necessarily theological in nature, and he is willing to use his skills as a philosopher, for the service of theology. So hopefully that makes sense. I guess the point that I'm trying to note here is that what seems to me at least unique about Calov, and you can tell me if this kind of resonates with what you've read, is that he is, almost as much of a philosopher as he is a theologian, which is not something that like people typically would expect of a Lutheran theologian, because I think that in our day and age, there's this like narrative or stereotype the Lutherans are anti-philosophical, and in this way, Calov is like sort of an antidote to that misconception.
I would
Yeah,
just
I guess.
say that. Oh, do you
Okay.
mind if I add something real quick?
No, you can go first. What do you want to
Can I
say?
add something after you, by the way? We're just
Yeah,
going to
please.
group pile on this.
Yeah. But well, that's kind of. I haven't read Cal yet. Full disclosure. I've read snippets of him and like Schmidt and others. But my general impression of him from everything that I have seen and heard is that a good way to think of somebody like Chemnitz or Gerhard or even Quenstedt when compared to Caleb is that those figures are really they know their philosophy really well, but they don't necessarily use it, and they don't, or I won't say they don't use it, but they aren't writing extensive philosophical treatises, whereas Caleb is, if that makes sense. Were you gonna say something, Cameron, or were you joking?
Yeah, no, I actually was. I was going to say that Preuss brings this up, that I think Calov is one of the first ones that, like if you read Gerhard, if you read pretty much most of our scholastics up to a certain point, they say things about reason that are kind of just like, sometimes you kind of are just like, oh, that sounds kind kind of weird, you know, like what are they getting at by that? And it sounds like, you know, Preuss makes this point that Kalov's one of the first ones that just makes like a really, really strong claim to the point where theology and philosophy just do not contradict, like, period. You know, in the abstract. In the concrete, they do, and that's like a sanctification problem. But if you look in Gerhard, I mean, he does say certain things, you know, especially earlier in his career that sound, you know, very double truthy in certain respects, right? And you don't see that in Calov, and I think that's interesting because I think he's a thinker that is like more willing to sort of, you know, coalesce the evidence in a way that's you know, more sensitive to the concerns of like the philosophers and the broader scholastic tradition.
Yeah. So yeah, that's great what you said there, Cameron. I guess I do want to say a few things though. Like, at least from my understanding, the one who really like made sure like Lutherans didn't like just violated the principle of non-contradiction, at least like like formally, right? Like in like maybe not formally, but like like kind of like emphasize that, right? I think it was like Martini or one of the Martinis who kind of emphasized that, and like that's like one of the philosophers before Calov, but like and so kind of Calov kind of like took that up as it were, but like I guess one of the things like as you were saying before, like I believe you were saying the same. Like you can think of Calov as like his own philosopher, and I think you really can actually, because like I don't know, this is like because I guess in terms of like my sort of like background in like philosophy, I've like I like Samuel and like Cameron are more like scholastic, read in scholastics. I admit that, but I guess I'm more read into like the German idealists and like the early moderns, and like so essentially, I feel like Calov is like this looming shadow over all the German modern, all early modern German philosophy from Lessing, Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, showing like if you no, it's actually like very surprising when you read about it. It's like oh no, like Calvin in a lot of ways kind of predates them, and I feel like in some ways some of them are actually kind of like actively responding to him, but not by name usually.
Yeah, and there's
It's
even
actually
been like
surprising.
secondary.
It's like crazy to me once you realize this.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, there's even been like secondary literature that has come out about this. You know, we've talked about it, you know, on other platforms, but I don't know how you say his name, but the Cigarby book where it talks about how like, you know, Kant was, you know, influenced by Calov. I believe you read that, right?
Yes, I believe. And I believe it also said like it's probably very likely that Kant probably taught like before I guess moving into I forget what's his name. Like he was one of the Leibnizian philosophers. I think Baumgarten. Yeah, I think it was
Yeah,
Baumgarten. Before he
Baumgarten. Yeah.
Oh,
started
sorry.
teaching out of that like philosophy textbook, he taught like probably taught like maybe one course in philosophy from like Kalov's textbook, like one of his metaphysics. So it's like it's actually interesting, right? If you read the Critique of Pure Reason, it looks like Kant is sort of like like he's reacting against Kant, like reversing his unitary transcendentals and starting with space and time first before going on to like the true and the good, right? It's kind of very interesting, and there's a lot of like Scarby is kind of pretty good in like showing. Oh yeah, there's a lot of parallels in that as well. Like the architectonic, well, like in terms of like order, like the idea of like this idea of the knowable, it's like nostalgia and stuff. So there's like a lot of like let's say influence that's been documented with like let's say Calov and Kant, but it's not just Calov and Kant though. Like because you can look at Leibniz, I think he has like I don't know if it's a dissertation. I read it somewhere where essentially like he has like he's like reacting against Calov like negatively because it was something about what is it something about was it obediential potency. It's like one of these like or objective potencies or something like Cal's like what was Cal's view on this or something or other. He was reacting against. It was like part of his thesis or something or some sort of like large work he had that Leibniz was reacting to against Calov. Lessing just doesn't like Calov. He has this famous line where like no one doesn't want to be like a Christian under Calov's grace. Hegel is also kind of interesting because I also like because it's like we can might be able to get more into this right because like Calov has this really like well developed like strong notion of let's say like objective or intentional being versus like real being and like how like let's say God's intellect as truth, right? It's sort of the constitutive like foundation of everything in some sense. So like everything is like true, and in this transcendental sense due to God's intellect. And I kind of like it's kind of like there's there's a few more things too, like in terms of like how they conceptualize like how God's knowledge relates to the world and to His will, that are like, oh yeah, this is actually kind of like the same, right? Because if you know Hegel, right, like he has this idea like where the absolute is like the absolute idea and so forth, right? Where all truth kind of comes from that in a sense, and that kind of parallels kind of like how Kalov's kind of views like how God's knowledge works, where like God just knows, like just know. Like, this is kind of crazy when you first learn about it too. Like God just knows everything, like prior to like any like technical, prior to any like decree of acts of will in a sense, which I thought was quite crazy when I first learned about it. And we could go maybe we can go more into that if you want, but I thought that was kind of interesting. But I guess just to like last thing I want to say is like I feel like in terms of Kant and Hegel, they read Calov, but they kind of go in two different directions. Because if you read Kant, right, he has this idea where like you have these a priori like sort of like I can't remember. It's not the categories. It's like these yeah, it's sort of these he sort of has these categories, but they're in the mind now, which kind of like they're like the powers of the mind where like okay, given an object, there's corresponds some like power in the mind that kind of like makes it this object like apprehendable to the intellect, because they has to work to sort of like get the object into like the intellect and sort of like get knowledge sort of running. While in Hegel's view, you have like it where like spirit is sort of like saturated in everything, so the mind doesn't really have to work as hard to like sort of like get it. You can just let's say you have a book here, you perceive the book, now the book's in your mind because like there's no like real opposition, right, between subject and object and ideal and real. And I feel like if you read Calov, right, he has like aspects of both, but like it's like a middle position actually, because like Calov has this position where the intellect is active, right, in like let's say uh you know abstracting from like sense data, right, or from the phantasms, right, these different objects, right, and like abstracts it and gets it into a abstracts it and like presents it as a formal concept in the mind. But this formal concept is like is really just if it's like it created object, right, it's just really the thing, but it's in its ideal state, not really in its like real state, right? So this is where like, oh yeah, it's like what Hegel would want. I was like, oh yeah, it's like this ideal state is being determined by like, oh yeah, the real object in its fundamental object state. Sorry if I was going too much into there, but like I guess the main thing I just wanted to say was like in terms of like sort of like epistemology, it seemed like Calv was sort of like the middle, and like Kant and like Hegel just took what he thought and like into two different directions, opposite directions. Sorry, you guys can
Yeah,
talk
I
now.
was gonna add something because you mentioned Leibniz, and this is kind of probably speculative in terms of how some of these ideas reach them. But Leibniz, I know, is very sympathetic to forms of syncretism, and it sounds like he probably would be within the same like sort of school of thought as Calixtus, and
Yeah,
presumably some of these more like mediating Lutherans like von Pudendorf and others, right, who were kind of in the same like mold. And yeah, it seems like how it reaches Kant is kind of interesting because yes, Baumgarten, is semi-orthodox Lutheran. I probably as good as you can expect in the 18th century. Like his brother's a theologian, maybe kind of pietistic, but he probably is decently well read in Calov as a result, right? And Christian Wolff is, as far as I know, kind of on the edge, but still probably more orthodox than Leibniz was, right? In terms of his Lutheranism. So yeah, that's interesting. I think what you're probably getting is because when Leibniz's ideas like reach Baumgarten and Wolff, it does seem like they're already trying to kind of clean up like some of the hardcore rationalism, right? Like they're not
yeah,
like as big on like this like weird sort of like containment theory
Monads.
of propositions. I'll say that again.
Yeah, monads everywhere.
I mean, that actually is still kind of in the system. I'd say the bigger issue is that Leibniz tried to, at one point, and it's controversial, he tried to, in a sense, kind of affirm that like all propositions are like necessary. And a lot of these other theologians try to like kind of adjust their systems to kind of not, have that weird conclusion. And it sounds like Calov's kind of a interesting bridge figure. Leibniz probably didn't receive him that positively, but that's not like to be expected because Leibniz wanted union with Rome, right? And von Pudendorf wanted union with the Reformed. And Calov is not someone that you're going to have a particular fond opinion of if you want to have union with either of those groups.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, or were you going to say something, Jared?
Sorry, no, I wasn't going to say anything. Go for it, Samuel.
Well, I guess just a question I have is, so like, I think we've kind of documented some of Calov's like philosophical influences and the way that he approached some of these questions within the domain of like philosophy. But to what extent would you say that, philosophy was serviceable to Calov, in his vocation as a theologian? And this is what particularly interests me about Calov, because, I'm not like super interested in like philosophy as by itself, but I am interested in philosophical theology, and this is where Calov has always caught my attention because just to give an example, right, like there have been times where I've read certain explanations of a given topic from some of the Roman Catholic scholastics like John of St. Thomas or from Scotus, right, and I'm like, man, I don't really see this within the Lutherans, like the same degree of like philosophical precision. But then I encounter Calov and I'm like, oh, he actually is like saying a lot of these same things. And I only kind of flag this kind of anecdote to say that, Calov does seem like a lot more comfortable to utilize his like philosophical ability within the domain of theology. So like I encountered this when I was like studying the Lord's Supper, because to give an example, right, a practical example, the common question between Reformed and Lutheran Christians is whether or not external extension in relation to place is an essential attribute of corporeal substances, right? That's kind of the debated point. And Gerhard and Quenstedt and some of these other figures, like they will give these kind of responses, but usually they're either to the effect of like, well, it's an accident and it's, we kind of leave it at that. Or typically they'll say that, that's just kind of a rule of philosophy and we shouldn't like use that as a magistrate in the domain of theology. But when I got to Calov and I was actually, reading some portions of his Scripta Philosophica, he actually did make a lot of the same arguments as, the Roman Catholic scholastics and, even like from the Scotus tradition, where Calov was arguing how we could distinguish between like internal and external extension, and there's a difference between having part outside of part in relation to place and in relation to essence, so on and so forth. I don't need to, bore people with the details. But the point is that I do think it's fascinating how like Calov seems to be like this great systematizer of the Lutheran theological tradition, perhaps in a way that, we don't see too much in other figures. So would you agree with that assessment that like he kind of brings in these philosophical insights into his kind of construction of his theological system?
Yes, and I do want to qualify it with a little bit, right? Because I was reading him on, let's say, like, oh yeah, how we can like against the Socinians, right? Against like why they say like, let's say God doesn't know the future, right? Because the future doesn't exist, and all this other stuff, right? Because so God kind of, I feel like, has this really like sophisticated answer on like, oh yeah, no, God really can have knowledge of the future, like certain knowledge of the future. And the more you think about it, the more it makes sense too. But even then, though, like, it has all these like different like paragraphs and like, oh yeah, this is why, so on and so forth. Like he does make this like proviso at the end, and I guess to be fair, he does cite like his opponent because technically his opponent should agree with this too. It's like even if I can't explain this on that account, like I shouldn't like just reject it, right? It's kind of that idea. So the idea is like Calov is so the idea is like Calov is okay with mystery in a sense, but like if we can give an explanation on like why it works, it's like, oh yeah, that's like it's kind of like that's pretty good. And like maybe like well reasoned sort of explanation that's sort of like that follows through from his philosophy, And like, oh yeah, if it works, it works. But like, just on like, like just think about it like practically, right? Like, if you have like some lay person, right, and they like encounter, like, let's say, an open theist, and they heard these arguments before, right? It's like, oh no, maybe like God really doesn't know the future now because of something about time or whatnot. They shouldn't just like because of that, they shouldn't just like accept open theism, right? They should like, I mean, I guess the open theists will disagree with this, but they should like read the Bible, right? Or like hear the word of God, and they realize, oh wait, no, like it says, right, that God, pretty much, maybe not in strict, the words that the open theists would like, but in the sense, right? God knows future contingents, right? And they should like, like just accept that sort of like on faith, but like, it's not, but it's not like it's like contradictory like in itself. It's kind of the idea, right?
Yeah.
It's more so like we can't really like comprehend it like in our minds because like our intellect is measured by things, not like our things like measure thing or intellect measures things, right? Our things measure the intellect is kind of, I think, one of his phrases he uses in his Newology is kind of that. So the main idea is like even if we can like kind of explain it, right? If it like rationally, if it's not like per se like contradictory, like A is not A. If God does it, it's like, oh wow, it seems like very strange what he did, but it's like it doesn't seem like contradictory to us. Like we should like just because we're Christians, right? We should just accept it on faith. Is that a bad explanation, Cameron? I don't know.
No. I was actually going to ask, like, as a follow up on that, like, were there any like real like original insights that you saw in Calov on like the doctrine of God or God's power or things like that that really sort of like stuck out to you?
Well, yeah, actually, like, yeah, a few things actually. If you take Calvin's view on like his philosophy and how he conceives of God, like open theism, just like you don't really have a lot of ways of attack, right? Because right, if you, I don't know if you're familiar with like the current how the analytics kind of view open theism right now, right? And like how they have like these different, like they're taking advantage of these like logical moments of like God's life, right? Where they have like, oh yeah, because of this act of will, there's like sort of like a moment when in which like God doesn't know like future contingents, right, against like the Reformed and the Molinists. But if you take Calvin's view, it's like, oh no, God like knows everything like prior to any act of will, which is like really strong like kind of claim. But if you, I mean, I guess I could try and explain it to you if you want to, like how this actually works out. But
Yeah.
or at least the best to my ability how it works out. But like, yeah, that seems to be like sort of a claim where like, oh yeah, God just knows everything just because he is like truth itself in some sense. And
Yeah, I was actually like on that. So like like let's using like the three moments categories, in terms of like the main divisions of God's knowledge. And I actually don't know how Calov divides that. Does he consider knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to essentially be like kind of included within like a category of free knowledge? Because I know some of the later scholastics did stuff like that. Or does he consider that like its own distinct moment? Like some people say that that's like the knowledge of the conditional future is what they call it, right? And some people call like middle knowledge just middle knowledge, and so like how did those all play out for him?
Well, I guess well, I guess in terms of the relation of middle knowledge, I guess in a sort of very technical way, you can say Calov said yeah to middle knowledge, but in the most sentences, it's like Calov kind of like rejects middle knowledge and like okay, how most people kind of conceive of it as like what is it, counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, because like so essentially what Calov is kind of like pressing at against reform because he makes a distinction in like what's called like God's, was it hypothetical knowledge or like knowledge based on a condition, and I guess God's what is it? Uh, God's like, and that's like a part of like God's like I think what we call it now like God's natural knowledge or God's knowledge of not simple intelligence. No, it'll be God's, yeah, it'll be part of God's knowledge of simple intelligence. So like God knows, okay, if this happens, then this occurs. So like sort of, so this is how I view it. It's like sort of like these if-then statements, sort of like God knows just naturally, because he's agreeing with he's agreeing with like a reform guy actually on this who taught Buddhism. I think his name was like Wallius, on like sort of middle knowledge, because Wallius also kind of wanted middle knowledge, but not really, right? So same thing with Calov. He kind of like, oh yeah, he likes sort of some concepts of middle knowledge, but he doesn't really like how Molina would kind of characterize middle knowledge. Like God just knows everything. Like since he's omniscient, he's just necessarily omniscient. It's kind of the idea. So what kind of does the work? I guess if you want to say knowledge of let's say future contingents for him is his knowledge of vision, and the way how Calov kind of knows knows future contingents is via like this idea of like all things are like sort of like objectively or ideally present to Caliph in the divine ideas, and not necessarily like against like some Thomists. Like I guess he cites Alvarez on this, and I think also Cajetan might have also agreed with this, like this real presence from eternity, sort of in some sense, or against the Scotus and like the Dominicans and the Reformed, right, where like you have these sort of this predetermination either by like some absolute decree or like these physical pre-motions, because Calvin is going to reject the physical pre-motion account and the absolute decree account pretty strongly. The account for like real presence from eternity, he doesn't reject it as too much, like too strongly as the other ones, but he just thinks it's not as necessary. He thinks like presence according to ideal viewing or like objective viewing is sufficient for like, oh yeah, Calv can like go, in Calvin's view, how God can know like future contingents.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean the point I was making was more that like it seems to me that like a lot of the later scholastics, want to include, what we would effectively call middle knowledge within the theology of vision, right? They would say it's a very specific species of that, right? It's like essentially, it's knowledge of the future on a certain condition. Like if God did will this state of affairs, this would happen, right? Or something to that effect. And yeah, like that's kind of a hard category to parse out. A lot of the thinkers I've noticed, like even Arminius, who explicitly says that God has middle knowledge, like people debate what he means by that, right? Like, does he mean precisely what Molina means? And yeah, like the question I was, maybe you don't know this because I'm actually not that read in Suarez on this question myself, but yeah, like do you think that like his perspective on that issue, on the issue of like counterfactuals of creaturely freedom or whatever, you said it's not like the Dominican view, right? Like it's not
physical pre-motion. He rejects physical pre-motions. That's I at least know that much.
Right.
He rejects absolute decree, and
but he does affirm that there are these like statements in the scriptures to the effect of if like these two cities saw these miracles, they would repent, that sort of thing. But his account is not quite like Molina's precise account, where it's like super comprehension, where God's just kind of like looking at these individual essences. He's like, Samuel over here, I just know Samuel, I just understand his being, and I can just have like some weird sort of like set of like propositions just based on knowing Samuel. Whereas like Suarez's view is just like God is infinite and he knows all truths, and some counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are true. So therefore, God knows them. And like, where would you say his position lies between those like two extremes? Is it kind of in the middle, or is it more close to Suarez, or where would you say?
Let's see here. I guess I haven't read I guess to be fair, here it's more modern Molinist, right? With the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. But I guess I was like translating parts of Calov like on like Providence, and he sort of like mentioned like, oh yeah, like what is it, what is it? I don't know. He was quoting some other Lutheran who was like who didn't really like how the Jesuits were using like middle knowledge and like and I guess maybe some Arminians too, where like it's sort of like for conversion, right? It's sort of like God converts you based on sort of like this response, right? That he kind of foreknows. And it's like, oh yeah, because of this foreknow, oh yeah, he's gonna like, like he's gonna like like based on this knowledge, like because you're gonna like convert. That's why he's gonna like, oh yeah, give you this grace so you can convert or something like that. Because like I guess to be fair, like with Calov, I get the bigger impression, like not so much like this knowledge, like this middle knowledge, is really important for Calov. I feel like the more, I guess, pressing kind of like distinction Calov wants to make is this distinction between God's absolute will and God's like conditioned will, kind of, where like it's called conditioned because of the objects, right? Not that like God's will is conditioned, and sort of like through his conditioned will, like God can like will if they have faith, right? They will believe, but also God, like kind of like sort of in a way, like will is the means as well to that, and right, with these various kind of like right, different like let's say steps or conditions, right? That God wants, that God just places there. I feel like that's the more pressing thing he wants to concern, and that's sort of like how he kind of conceives of like this hypothetical knowledge, and like if what is it, right? If this if this thing like happens, then this will occur. Like God knows it because uh maybe not based on his will, but like but it's sort of like he wants that sort of knowledge to be in God, and it's sort of like related, I feel like, to his distinction on like conditioned and absolute will. I'm sorry, this is probably not
No,
the
I mean,
best
this is
answer, because
actually
he
really
because he like smushes like this hypothetical knowledge right into like God's natural knowledge or knowledge of simple intelligence. So like I'm not as familiar with like Suarez's
Yeah.
view, or like I know a little bit of Molina's view on this and how they view like middle knowledge. I thought they viewed it as like three distinct sort of like moments in a way, right? So I don't. So that's why I was thinking, because I don't like because it doesn't seem like he's like viewing it. I guess maybe as the later Lutheran dogmatists might be viewing it, right, as like part of now God's knowledge of like vision, right? He's viewing it as like a like sort of like a subset of like God's knowledge of simple intelligence. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but
yeah, no,
I'm
it
sorry.
actually does. Yeah, I mean that's actually an interesting one. And I'll probably this whole discussion. There's other questions that need to be asked, but like last thing I was going to say is, yeah, I mean I find it interesting that to the extent that our dogmaticians really talk about it, it pretty much does not have like a role in election whatsoever. To the extent it has any sort of role, it's in like the doctrine of providence, right? And
Yeah.
it's important to that, but it's not important to our doctrine of election. And in fact, I remember Gerhard, who's obviously not Calov, but I'm using an example here. He actually sharply rebukes some of the Jesuit doctrines of predestination, which were like strongly individual, unconditional election views, and in a sense, at least. And Gerhard comes out strongly against that because he thinks that some of the justifications that were being used were kind of just inherently particularist, whereas our doctrine of predestination, even in which is a question I want to ask you actually, because I know we've had a discussion about this at one point, but I'll save that. But like, yeah, it seems like our doctrine of predestination is like much more, it's anti-particularist, whereas I think a lot of the Catholics were trying to kind of resolve like the fact that Augustine was a particularist in certain respects, with the fact that they wanted to affirm like a strong doctrine of free will, and so that seems to be where Molina lands. Whereas for us, it's like, yeah, we kind of agree with Molina on like one or two things, but we don't agree with his justification for it, right? Because that's not our justification. Our justification is that God wants everyone to be saved. But yeah, Jared, I know you have more questions to ask, so apologies for the tangent I caused, but I appreciate your thoughts, by the way. Those were really well thought out.
Well, I wasn't going to ask a very specific question. I know Samuel has one that he wants to get into that's related, but what I do want to say is that this is something I talk about, and I think this may be relevant for Calov here with respect to something like middle knowledge. Um, whenever when I talk about middle knowledge people, some people come up to me and say something like, "Do you affirm Molinism or not?" I'm like, "Well, I think we have to make a distinction between middle knowledge as such and middle knowledge as applied to the doctrine of predestination." Because what I like to say is, I it's one thing to say middle knowledge is a real valid kind of knowledge that God has. It's another to say that is a really important factor in predestination. It's
Yeah.
it's it's kind of like saying, "Oh, do you affirm that bread and wine exist? Oh, therefore, the Eucharist is necessary or something." Like you affirm the real presence. Like, well, it's kind of weird to say that. Doesn't follow. But yeah, Samuel, you had a question.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask because you kind of started touching on it a little bit, but I know that you've mentioned it before, and other times that we've had a conversation. But can you tell us a little bit about how you think Calov differs from actually some of the other Lutheran dogmaticians on the question of predestination in election? I know that you've mentioned in the past how you see Calov's construal of this issue to be, noticeably different from other figures. I think you've mentioned Quenstedt and Bayer and Hollatz, and how I believe you've said in the past that Calov seems to be one of our more monergistic theologians on this question, and in that respect, it seems to be more within the line of Luther and Chemnitz on.
Well, yeah, I guess to be fair though, I did have just a preface, right? I remember talking to this other person. He seemed more interested in the later dogmaticians, so he was trying to sort of explain to me oh yeah, this new language of is being kind of this new language. I think the later dogmaticians adopt is probably coming from what's his name, Musaeus, and it's I don't know, it's very I agree with Cal. This is you shouldn't have you know you shouldn't have introduced this new language of predestination. So maybe just to give Hollatz and Quenstedt their due, and Bayer is maybe makes sense in this new sort of language that Musaeus kind of wants Lutherans to kind of affirm for predestination and hopefully make it useful or something. But yeah, I guess, and if you just read it on a surface level, right? Let's say, especially Hollatz is not really good at this. Yeah, their doctrines of predestination seem kind of synergizing in a way, or kind of leans toward that direction. But if you read Calov is at this moment in Lutheran history where he's trying to I guess it was due to controversies with Latterman and in status and conversion, where he's trying to be as monergistic as he can within the Lutheran tradition, within the Book of Concord in a sense. So that's kind of how I view it, because he's he's got, but he also Calv has this really big tome against the Armenians and why they are wrong, right? And so he's familiar with the Armenian view on conversion, right, predestination. So it seems to me he kind of takes great pains to kind of show, yeah, we're not synergists in election or in conversion, and it's all a Caleb just strays out against the Armenians, denies what is it what was it called, prevenient grace the Armenians kind of use. Essentially he's just no, this is not, I don't want this, get it out, kind of idea. And he kind of I mean, not rants, but starts writing against this, kind of that view, a lot of pages, and that, and against the Latterman too. And I guess in terms of election as well, I guess, I mean, I guess looking at Kalov's doctrine of election, I guess in um maybe indifference from say Gerhard, or maybe even Chemnitz, is I feel Calv is kind of is very is very clear on what he wants to state, is how in my reading of him, and how he kind of construes the doctrine of predestination, election, um and how different ways you can sort of say what predestination, election mean, right? It's sort of oh yeah, it's just predestined, I think he says, let's look at it again, but I think he says, right, in providence, like predestination and election are underneath providence or something as like a special type. But like there's there's several other things I think he says. I need to translate it more. I shouldn't say too much, but but yeah, no, I get the impression like he's, let's put it this way, against the later dogmaticians, he seems more like monergistic, and against the early, well, I guess to be fair, mostly Gerhard, he's much more clear on what he's saying.
Sure. One
Yeah.
question I have, you mentioned, oh, Cameron, do you want to say anything?
No, it'd probably end up in like another, tangent. So I'll let you go there.
We've had a lot of fun, but one thing I wanted to ask, because you mentioned the translation aspect, and that's how should I say it? Sorry, I'm just laughing at a comment I just saw. But so you talk about, how you've read Calov's works, or a good amount of them. So, and you're translating them, which is why we're having you on here. Can you tell us a bit about the translations that you've done and what specific works there that are being translated, that you have translated or you want to? Just kind of like
Yeah.
Calov's bibliography of sorts.
Okay, I guess the current works I have translated. The first one I did, this one was like I think probably a year ago. Is like I translated Calov's Nostology from his Scriptus Philosophica. That was kind of like interesting. So this is sort of related. So this is sort of like Calov's like study of the knowables. Essentially, it's like the habit of the knowables, and like okay, what is like what is a knowable, right? What it like what is what is ratio is, right? What is a concept, right? What is abstraction? Kind of explains all of that, right? And then I guess this is sort of related to I guess, can I say this? I think I can. I think it's okay. So I think I forget who it was who introduced me to them, but I believe there was this one person like from another Discord. Like I think it was in Dr. Jordan Cooper's Discord server who like introduced me to this other Discord because there's a bunch of like reform people as well who I didn't any one reform person wanted to know more about Calov, and I sort of like introduced them to like AI translations, but then they started doing AI translations, which is kind of pretty cool because now we have like stuff from Alsted and whatnot. But like I guess the thing is like I was using AI translations earlier from that. It was like ChatGPT, so that's kind of like I know a little bit of Latin, but I don't know it, as well as I should. So that's kind of the main way I was translating it. But like the translations from ChatGPT were good or at least they were good, but like I heavily edited it. And then like the going back to what I was saying about this reform guys I was meeting, I met, they were starting using this Claude, and it turns out Claude is so much better because you can just like instead of me transcribing everything into like ChatGPT, you can like just get a PDF of your like thing you want to translate, and then you upload that file to Claude and start translating it for you, and that's kind of nice. So like so from that, like one reform guy who's he pretty much translated Calov's general metaphysics, but I was like sort of a proof editor in a way because I read a lot of like his general metaphysics before, and I realized, oh wait, no, there's like very large portions that were missing. It was on like I don't know if you saw it, Jared, because I sent it in an email, right,
Yep, I
on like
remember that.
his general metaphysics. I think Seth might have gotten it, but like it was essentially like missing like a whole bunch of like, oh yeah, what is the science of metaphysics? And that's like, oh, this is not good. So like we had to like retranslate that, and I got like I corrected some stuff from there, and then after that, I think it was just mostly me like like translating like the special metaphysics, Kalov's tractate on method. And I think
Mhm.
what else? I think we were both translating his newology. I think that's how it went, and I guess I also translated the preface. So in terms of like the translated works that are like I guess technically completed, even though I kind of still want to edit them like probably heavily because I want to make sure like oh yeah first off like oh yeah it's saying what it's saying and like oh yeah we didn't actually miss it didn't like clip off right some like line from the Latin text. Like we translated Calov's Nostology, which is this on the habit of the nobles. Calov's Newology, which is on I think the habit of like first principles of knowing. So like the law of non-contradiction.
Wouldn't that be like
Then we did.
like I know,
Huh?
like for instance, Aristotle, he distinguishes like 5, cognitive habits, and one of them would be like intelligence, which would be like the
Yes.
affection between things, and like how certain terms relate to one another. And if I'm understanding correctly, that is kind of what Calov treats in his.
Yeah, that is the habit of intelligence for him in
Yeah.
Newology. That's what he treats. And then
Yeah.
after that, you have like general metaphysics, and then after that, you have special metaphysics, and then we have his preface to his all of his philosophical works, and then we have like his tractate on method that I translated, which corresponds to like the third operation of the mind from like Melanchthon, right?
Yeah.
So like that's actually kind
There's
of a lot,
also
actually.
the translation that somebody from the Reform server did on the Eucharist as well.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
guess I guess those are like most of the big translations. I guess I also like I've been translating like questions and like other like snippets from Calov's Systema. It's like, oh, this is kind of cool. I want to translate this, so I do, and then I put it somewhere in a Word doc. I guess that was, to be fair, that's mostly me, but I sometimes post it in the Discord there. But yeah, that's like that's mainly like what I've been like translating so far. And I guess in terms of like future translations of, I guess specifically, let's say Calov first. I guess I was thinking maybe his like different disputations against, let's say, like Calixtus or Bome, or like maybe some of the Reformed. I'm still thinking about what to do because I'm still like because because I'm still more motivated to like okay read through like what we translated and then like correct everything first, like edit it before like translating, something else. But yeah, that's kind of like the current state of translations.
Yeah, I'd be curious to learn from you how you use Claude because now I'm admittedly suffering because I'm translating Chemnitz right now. I've got a good amount of, like the omitted portions of the Loci Theologici, and I'm suffering because it's double column, and so I
Oh,
can't just
okay.
like throw it into Claude. I have to like take a screenshot and then copy paste to Claude, to ChatGPT. But I'd be really curious to see how you do that. I'd love to learn it from you because I could probably pump some stuff out. There are some like single column like Chemnitz sermons I want to put through somewhere. But yeah, that
Okay.
sounds really cool. I'm just curious, and I understand if this is kind of off the cuff a bit, but are there any other thinkers that you want to translate? Because I know you're working so much on Calov now, but is there anybody else that you're really interested in?
I feel like we should probably translate Shafarius and like Glacius and maybe
Yeah,
Martini and Schleber if we can. So yeah, I guess it'll be like Shafarius, so Schleber, Martini, and Glacius are kind of like the big
Yeah.
guys I feel like we should like translate that are not like, let's say, like the big systematizing dogmaticians,
I think
because
those
they have a lot of work. Like Martini and like Schleber are really big in like philosophy in general. Shafarius because he has this massive tome in logic, and Glacius because he has this giant like book on like grammar, rhetoric, like so it's like in terms of like foundations, right, for theology, right, to do like maybe systematic theology, these people will be good to translate in the sense that like if people like learn from them, they can have like a good like foundation to do like systematic theology, and then we can like in the sense that like okay, people can now like sort of like going off from what they learned there, they can start creating their own systematic theologies, hopefully, or like dogmatic
Yeah.
theologies out of like the maybe tradition of, let's say, Quenstead or whatnot, in the sense that people now have like the fundamentals down. You know what I'm saying? Or is it a
Yeah,
little?
yeah. I was going to
Is it?
say
Is it?
props to you in pursuing, I think, a lot of the more like philosophically astute, like sort of systematic theologians, particularly in the Lutheran tradition, because like I can tell you as someone who went to school for philosophy and spoke with a lot of like profs that kind of did like some work in this area, they pretty much said, yeah, this is like one of the most fertile areas of like philosophy that most people just kind of, it is kind of the dark ages in a weird way, right? Because it's like a lot of people do work on the scholastic era, which is technically the real dark ages. But like not a lot of people do work on like Renaissance philosophy, high scholasticism, or or this Baroque scholasticism period. And to the extent that they do work in the Baroque scholasticism period, it's pretty much on Catholic thinkers like Suarez, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not
John C.
on
Thomas.
their Protestant equivalents, and I think that the Protestant equivalents were just as important. And well, I don't know if just as important, but they certainly have something to say. And if you're trying to understand a thinker like Leibniz or a thinker like, Christian Wolff or Kant, right? Certainly you have to understand them. And those thinkers are still, widely studied in, the broader Western philosophical tradition. And so yeah, like I would say there's a double benefit. Like it's a benefit to theologians, right? Because we as Lutherans want to read that sort of thing. But it's also a benefit to just people that are interested in philosophy, because you legit probably are going to have a hard time understanding Kant or Leibniz or von Pudendorf or some of these other people if you don't understand, Martini and, some of their precursors, So props to you on that.
And to say a little bit more on like the benefit for theologians, this is something that I've reflected on in recent times, and it is that like right now there seems to be a resurgence like in the Protestant community, like a sort of a retrieval effort to be more like in tune with our like scholastic heritage as Protestants. So right now it's like trendy for the Reformed and for even Reformed Baptist and for Lutherans to kind of utilize the scholastic method in their pursuit of theology. But one thing that's interesting is that like I think on the surface level, or like in popular culture, scholasticism is like largely reduced to Thomism. So you'll hear terms thrown around like Reformed Thomist or like Lutheran Thomist, which when the more you actually study the kind of the enterprise of scholastic theology, you begin to realize that that's like a massive oversimplification of the philosophical tradition, especially within the 17th century and the Baroque era. And I think one of the like major benefits of translating these figures like a Jacob Martini or like a Schabler or like a Calov is that it provides us as theologians with the philosophical tools to construct a theology, but those philosophical tools are actually commensurate with our theology, right? Because one of the things that you will notice is that there actually are differences between like Aquinas and a Jacob Martini or a Schibler or a Calov, and it's just it's artificial to just summarize them all as scholastics. So I think it's actually very helpful to have the philosophical tools to support and argue for our theology. And this is particularly interesting for me because I think as Lutherans, especially within like our conservative branches, we have done a very good job, I think, at conserving our theology. Like you even look at American Lutherans like Widener and like Widener and Krauth and what's his name, Pieper, and all of these figures, like they're constantly quoting our Orthodox dogmaticians. So like in terms of theology, we seem to be like we haven't lost sight of our Orthodox dogmaticians, but I feel like we have lost sight of like their philosophical presuppositions that allow them to be so effective. And this is something that we've talked about behind the scenes a little bit, that when you look at people like Walther, that's the name I couldn't think of, look at figures like Walther or Widener, they're quoting our Orthodox dogmaticians and they're using their scholastic conclusions, but in terms of their method or in terms of the way that they argue for certain things, they're not like truly scholastic. And I feel like one of the great merits and the work that you're doing is like being able to revitalize the tools to allow us to actually think like scholastics and to philosophize in a way that is on the one hand methodical and true, but then also like advantageous to our own kind of Lutheran conclusions. So sorry, that's kind of a little bit of a rant, but I just wanted to kind of say in summation there that it's like there's much utility in actually learning the philosophy that allows us to come to the conclusions which we did in the Lutheran tradition, rather than just kind of preserving and passing down the conclusions that our dogmaticians came to.
And that's part of the goal of this channel as such, because something I find is you have somebody like Dr. Cooper who's good on this, and you have, other people that like will casually mention it, but I find that a lot of people who are Lutheran and are into philosophy are almost like discouraged from it, and they're just shown, hey, here's Luther saying philosophy's bad. But it's like, well, a lot of our dogmaticians later used philosophy, and Luther, we don't quia Luther. Our formula of concord, which we do quia, uses these philosophical categories and terms, and we want to know them not merely for the sake of the conclusions they make, just to understand those phrases, but for the sake of actually reaching the same conclusions they do on the basis of scripture and right reasoning. Um, and so even though, you're not like officially part of the channel, Euler's people, and I'm just interviewing you, I just thought I'd thank you because we are working on the same effort in a lot of ways. And it's been really helpful having what you've been putting out.
Yeah, I guess picking back off of that. Um, yeah, I agree with you. Like a lot of the later American Lutherans, like yeah, they were passing on all of these like conclusions, but they weren't. How would you say? They weren't really passing on like let's say the method or like you know, is method the best way to phrase it? I guess
Yeah,
yeah, the
I
method
think
or
method
like
makes sense.
how sort of like our dogmaticians kind of reach those conclusions, right? In the sense or like why they or like the why on okay, why are we taking this, stance on something, X, Y, and Z, right? Against let's say the reformed. Like or at least they're passing on okay, yeah. We like all these conclusions from the Lutheran, dogmaticians, but they aren't like really like you know they aren't I guess the thing is like they aren't really like like thinking about it as like a Lutheran scholastic would in like of like you know you have your thesis here, right? You have your like yeah, because like I don't know, I like Calov's analytic method. It's really like very organized, right? And
It
it's
is.
very methodical in how he kind of like gets to like okay, some like question or status of the controversy, right? And I guess I do want to say something though, like maybe as a how do I phrase this? Sort of as like a compliment. Maybe it's a little different though, but I do like how I guess in the like let's say LCMS, right, or like in I guess at least the American Lutheran context, I do like it how like I don't know, we do have like really nice like Bible commentaries, and I guess I feel like a lot of the pastors really know like at least this is my personal experience. A lot of the pastors really know like the Bible, like in terms of like let's say biblical studies, right? Or like they know like the I think don't this is me quoting Cameron here. I think like in terms of I guess this is more so in terms of like evangelicals, right? Like evangelicals kind of like if they're like on the more I guess well-read side. They know like all the bits and pieces of the Bible, right? They know the ancient Near Eastern context. They know like the the Hellenistic context, right? They have these pieces together and they kind of know the bits and pieces of the Bible. And I feel like also too with like how the LCMS is like it's kind of like it feels like oh yeah it's geared toward that way with like the commentaries and that's I actually kind of like that like because we are like this is like God's revelation to us, right? It is like preserved through the centuries, right? And I do like that, but I do think like I don't know, I feel like some of the I don't know, this is at least online, some of the online reformed, I feel like they kind of like put the two against each other. Like you can't be a scholastic and like studying the Bible like in depth and like looking at its ancient context, right? Because I want to know like how Moses wrote like what's the context Moses is writing Genesis or Exodus, right? So on and so forth. Like I this is like a thing where like I feel like we shouldn't as like Gerhard said, right? Like we shouldn't like if they're not they're not contradicting. So like they're both like sort of complement each other. Uh, sorry if I was ranting there.
No,
No,
no.
I think that was super clear. I will say, yeah, one of the interesting things I think about like the LCMS's like reception of some of these like older thinkers, like I think Walther in many respects is very scholastic. Like he was kind of widely known as being like the great like representer of like certain scholastic doctrines. Like there was a 19th century anti-Walther manual that I read that said, Walther knows, the scholastics better than any man living today, right? I would say that what ended up happening is that the momentum of the scholastics just eventually it ceased. I would say it probably ceased around the 60s. And, Latin quit being sort of a requirement to learn at the seminaries, that was part of it. And so what we end up with is that we have good like Bible commentaries. I would agree with that. I think we have a very good like biblical theology tradition.
Yeah.
But like a lot of our like momentum on method or metaphysics or systematics, it's just not there because we're just like so far removed from that era, and we don't have people that are widely read in Latin.
Right.
We have some obviously, and they're doing good work. I mean, like the Gerhard translations are great.
Yeah, Benjamin Mays.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, there's certainly things that are kind of hard to deal with in our current structure. Like I've actually also dealt with that, Samuel, where it's like you encounter like some LCMS pastors where like I told them I was like a philosophy major, and they're just kind of like, you might want to think about that one.
Yeah.
It's like.
But I think also like to kind of add on to this conversation a little bit, I think one of the great benefits of translating works of Calov, for instance, like his tractate on method, is that it teaches you how to go about treating theological and philosophical questions.
Right.
And I think the reason why that's so important is because, theology is like an ever expanding enterprise. And we have different questions that we have to answer today than what we had to answer in the 17th century. And I think that, in terms of the questions that we needed to ask then, our dogmaticians handled it well. But I feel like there's so many more questions that need, that work needs to be done on. And it would just be better. We would be better equipped to address those issues if we could think clearly, like you mentioned, knowing how to identify the state of the question and how to formulate a thesis and how to use a syllogism to argue for your thesis and how to respond to objections and so on and so forth. And I think we can't utilize the tools from our own dogmatic tradition if you don't understand your own dogmaticians. Like, I don't want to name any names, but like I've had conversations, with pastors in the LCMS who themselves admit that like they would love to read some of their own theologians, but then get totally stumped when they hear a word like, formal cause or like, you know what I mean? It's like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then their own resources become unintelligible to them. So I think, there's kind of a dual benefit in, revitalizing the scholastic method. I would say, A, it just allows us to draw from like the wealth of our own tradition, but then B, it also equips our modern theologians to, tackle issues that we need to address today. Like, I feel like we've yet to see, and this may be like a statement of ignorance. If there's great work on this out there, then, somebody let me know. But I think, like today, it would be great to see like, a comprehensive, robust scholastic treatment about like, the metaphysics of like sexuality, or like what are the differences between, like is sex an accident or a proper accident, whatever this may be. That's just an example, right? Or in terms of like fellowship questions, but just being able to apply this like clear, concise way of thinking to issues today, so that we can just continue to expand our own tradition further than what it did in the 17th century. Like we don't want that to be the zenith of the Lutheran Church forever and ever.
I was going to add
I agree with this.
along those. Yeah.
Oh, can I say something really quick here?
Oh, sure.
Just two things. I mean, one of those things is that I think there are real ways we can contribute to be, I won't say fixing this but to really be adding on to it, is that like I personally at my church, I am leading a philosophy group of sorts where we get together once a month, having read a chapter of philosophy, and we discuss it. And all the stuff that we're reading, I mean, we only started a month ago, but we're meeting again, I think, next weekend. The stuff we're reading, I specifically have us read stuff that is related to theology or is beneficial for it. So like I'll put my notes in and I'll send it to everybody. And in those notes, I will specifically cite Lutheran figures using these terms. So this next week, we're talking about the four causes. And when I make my notes for it for everybody to see, I am going to be citing figures like Gerhard talking about formal cause of faith and so on. And then somebody else like, I don't know, the material cause of the church or something. So they can see, hey, this stuff is really valuable to know and to, well, learn for that matter. I think another thing is this, I think our era, for multiple reasons, is a true it's really fertile ground for this, because one, the translations that you are doing and people like that in the Reformed and Roman Catholicism, But also, I think that within the LCMS, a lot of our dogmatic stuff that at least are being used, like Pieper, I think that stuff is, I don't want to say out of date, like Pieper's wrong or anything, but I think it's, we've gotten to the point now where a lot of what Pieper is saying is not really what's going on now. Like he'll talk about things like the subjective consciousness and the ego of the theologian, like where it's like there's similar stuff today, but it's not quite the same. And a lot of the figures he cites that he's opposing, their ideas haven't really gone anywhere. Like, not many people are upholding them, really, even among the liberals, to where I think now is a good time to have more dogmatics texts, and those dogmatics texts can be scholastic. So I think we're just at a good time in light of technology, in terms of the issues we're facing, and that's part of the reason that I started this channel along with these other guys.
Yeah, I was just going to add really briefly. I mean, this isn't so much a question, but like sort of, on top of that, it is actually kind of funny that you can have a thinker like Graebner and Kretzmann. They wrote this book called Towards the Lutheran Union in like the 1940s, and they could appeal to the substance accidents distinctions and the matter form distinction is like these self-evident principles where it's like, independent of like your philosophical commitments, we're just going to start out with like these two, category distinctions. And we're going to like, kind of argue for, substantial, like, doctrinal conclusions just on the basis of that. And it's funny that we can get from that point in the 40s where that's just like very slim. It's like, okay, we're not going to like assume too much. We're just going to assume that which is like super self-evident, to the point where, Samuel can have pastors that are like, oh, what's matter? What's form, and so, yeah, like actually, I was going to ask, like, what's your sort of, like, vision of like how we got to this point? Like how do you think that we got to the point where like our pastors are just kind of like, not like exactly philosophically astute for the most part? And I'm not saying, like, I'm not painting with a broad brush here. Like, we have a lot of excellent pastors, like some of the best pastors in the world, I think, but like it's interesting, like, how we got to the point where it's just like, we're just like very anti-philosophical, like at our core, whereas I think that like pretty much all of our like theologians have a very like sort of, calculated and nuanced and, dare I say, charitable, way of viewing philosophy.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I guess I guess I haven't really thought about this as too often. I guess I would agree with you guys that part of sort of for this loss is like, the loss of like, Latin is a big one. But I guess also, I was thinking about this, maybe like the resurgence of other, how could you say, like modern systematic theologies, right? I guess, right, for Lutherans, right, it would be like, guys like Outlas, Bayer, right? And that's kind of like Ferde, right? That sort of school of like theology and like Luther studies, which sort of, um, because we don't like, have really access to Latin, and for a while, right, the English work, or we didn't have access to any English works of like the classical dogmaticians, and we had like these more recent guys that were pumping out all this stuff that didn't seem like as bad as, let's say, Boltmann or something. I guess maybe, and maybe that's how we got our like, very very like anti-philosophical approach, because on Luther also didn't like philosophy as well, and like these guys, the radical Lutherans, kind of didn't like philosophy as well. I mean, that's the best I could think about. But I haven't. But to be fair, I haven't really thought about this question, like why? Okay, why are we in the state that we are in now, right? So, and I guess, let me see here. Let me think about it for a bit. Um, I
Yeah, I
guess
think
also, I guess maybe if we wanted to push this back further, right? Instead of, let's say, not the 60s, but let's say push this back, I guess, for American Lutheranism, right, to like the time of like Walfer and the American theologians. I guess during that time period, there was like this, I guess, the dominant philosophy of that era, right? It wasn't really like this, you know, sort of like anti-philosophy kind of philosophy, right? That the radical Lutherans were kind of like sort of pushing, right? It was more so like, you know, various forms of Kantianism and Hegelianism, right? That was running about, right? And like I guess schools of thought that kind of followed Kant and Hegel and different interpreters of Kant and Hegel, right? It's kind of like what they were reacting against. Um, so I guess
Yeah.
I guess maybe part of the reason for them why he wasn't as prominent for them is like, oh yeah, like if you read Calov, he has like 12 volumes or something of like his system of theology. I don't think he can. That sounds like really expensive during that time, and I don't think he can like carry. I mean, like that and like access, right? It's probably in Germany somewhere or something. I
Yeah.
mean, well, I think they might have had some here, but like what I'm saying, right? It's not the materials weren't as like accessible, right? Everything's now like online, right?
Well,
And
yeah. I think
there's
another. Sorry that I mean to cut you off, but you guys can tell me what you think about this. But part of me is also inclined to think that like part of the reason why Lutheran dogmaticians in the past, and when I say in the past, I'm thinking of like Reformation authors and even post-Reformation authors. I think perhaps part of the reason why our own Lutheran Orthodox dogmaticians weren't like as keen on being philosophers is because they already existed in an intellectual climate where like the philosophical presuppositions of their day were favorable towards the Christian tradition. Like they weren't living in a culture where like most people were skeptics about like the most fundamental concepts of the natural world. And for that reason, kind of like Cameron hinted at earlier, they could just kind of like assert the substance accidents distinction and kind of take that for granted and use it for their theological advantage without actually having to like independently argue for these categories. Because pretty much everybody was like generally Aristotelian in that day, albeit with like differences and how that plays out. And you even see this like in our confessions as well. I forget where exactly it is, but there's like one part of our confessions where the author just says like, yeah, only an absolute fool would like deny the distinction between substance and accidents. Like everybody just takes this for granted.
That's in the formula. I can't remember if it's a solid declaration of the epitome.
Yeah, but it isn't.
Yeah, it's responding to Flacius.
Yeah, exactly. And it just kind of asserts that like, this category exists, right? But there's no independent argumentation for it. And I think the reason why there isn't is because like these were just the presuppositions of the day. But fast forward to the 21st century, and we're living like in this post-enlightenment culture where like many of our foundational philosophical presuppositions about the natural world have been challenged, and now we can't simply just kind of assert things without arguing for them. And I think that perhaps this is actually an occasion for Lutherans to like become philosophical in a way that we haven't necessarily in the past, precisely because what was once taken for granted is now being challenged. I'll kind of stop right there.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a funny point because there's this essay that this Roman Catholic philosopher Alexander Pruss wrote.
Top tier, I love him.
No, like excellent guy, but he wrote this essay where he was like, well, and I actually think at this point it's probably the case that like ironically enough, probably disproportionately high amount of conservative like Christian philosophers in like major American universities. I mean, not disproportionately in terms of the fact that like, I don't know, like 30% of America is probably broadly conservative Christian, but still, I mean, it's more than you would expect, probably more than like a lot of other academic disciplines. But at the point he was writing this, he just was like, well, like, why aren't there that many Christians in these fields? And it's because Christians typically take for granted a lot of like analytic philosophy claims, like the body-soul distinction, right? Like Christians just don't feel the need to debate that because the Bible kind of clearly spells it out. I mean, there are Christian materialists, but they're loonies, they belong in an asylum. That's all I'm saying.
Well, or at least they'll redefine materialism to be like, all right, is that really materialism? But
yeah, like exactly. And I think that we're at a point, and I've thought about this myself. It's like, yes, like you don't necessarily need to for your own benefit, but it might be a benefit to others to like, get involved in like, if you're philosophically astute or whatever, to actually, yeah, try to get a degree even at your own cost, because it could be a bit like a benefit to others. And Christians have a lot to say here. And I think that this, ironically enough, is probably one of the points where we actually need to engage and like engage ourselves with the philosophical mainstream here, because a lot of them are actually just kind of, looking for answers to things. I mean, like this is one of the weird things that I think that people don't get, that are just like, like normies, so to speak, is that most people just think that like, okay, well, like people in like philosophy are just kind of like eliminative, like determinist, right? Or eliminative, like materialist on things. And they're just like, okay, but no, they aren't. I'm telling you this as someone who like went to a program to this effect. Like, a lot of them are like panpsychists. Like a lot of them are exploring a lot of weird ideas. And if there's ever a time for like Christians to like re-engage with like the philosophical mainstream, it's like now, and I think this is the benefit of this, is that like secular people are looking for answers to these questions. And ironically enough, the best answers to these questions were answers that were given, 400 plus years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think something I have noticed, like in my own personal experience, is that like we're not living in the era of like new atheism anymore. I think like in the early 2000s, it was like popular to be like this just hardcore kind of like materialist atheist. But nowadays, like you said, Cameron, there are so many people like non-Christians who like are grasping for something more. And there's like I would say like most non-Christians that I encounter on a day-to-day basis are either, some form of like spiritual but not religious, or they're like idealists, or they believe in like some multiverse theory. But like the point is that like whatever it may be, it's like people I feel like are grasping for like something more than just like our empirical experience. And I feel like this is like very fertile grounds for Christians, like you said, to just re-engage the philosophical literature and the philosophical world to argue for what would seem to be common sense presuppositions on our end, but would actually be like very encouraging to the common person, to just kind of restore some of like their basic beliefs about how the world works.
Yeah, I guess I think I have three things I kind of want to say. I guess first thing you said, right, we don't, I guess maybe back then they didn't have to, overcome as many like they didn't have as many like there was a lot more presuppositions like people could have like assumed, and like, oh yeah, they wouldn't have been challenged on than like today, right? And that's partly the cause, right, for the loss of you know this the loss of, I guess, knowledge of this scholastic method. And I guess I was thinking about this, and I guess that's sort of right. I guess in terms of like the scholastic metaphysics, but I do think like at least if you look at the German philosophers, right, like after, let's say, Kant and Hegel, essentially if you read their dogmatic works, they were essentially just debating like what is revelation, what epistemology we should be using, kind of, and it's been like arguing against each other what's the best one. So I guess in that sense, there's like some sort of like engagement by the church to like these modern questions. The problem is like, except for like Philippi, I think all of them were kind of like heretical in some way. So that's kind of not I really like, useful. I guess it might be useful to like maybe read, okay, what they were saying about the epistemology, or like maybe on method or whatnot. But like I don't, you don't follow them on like theology proper or Christology, because it's probably heretical in some shape or form. On the next question though, on like how on, I guess, engagement with modern philosophers. Yeah, I was thinking about this too. Like I remember there's this one analytic philosopher, who shall not be named, Ryan Mullins, who was saying about
Yeah.
who was
Man,
saying
we're
something
starting turf wars all over the place here,
Go on with what you're
but
saying, though.
But yeah, no, I think he was saying something about like because he was doing stuff with like philosophy of time, and like he was complaining like, the guys who were like, how he says is like I can't imitate him. But like, he was essentially saying like, yeah, none of the guys who posit like an eternal God don't actually define what time is and don't have no idea. Like, because he always brings up the example of Augustine, right? Where like Augustine's like, if you ask me like, what it is, so like now I don't know, but if before I did know, or something along those lines, right? This quote from Augustine is where essentially it gets picked up sort of by the later medievals and whatnot. But the thing is though, like Calov actually hasn't really developed like well defined like notion of like what time actually is. And it's like I guess I was trying to ask this to you, Jared, too, because like I was looking like, there's like A theory, B theory, right? And like I was asking like, okay, what is time? Because right, because he thinks like, Mullins, right? Thinks like, oh yeah, time's like this uncreated substance, but like and it's like right, it's some sort of absolute time. And I was trying to figure out what like Calv would fall into, because because for him, right, like because this is under the affection of duration, which is like a unitary transcendental affection for him. So in some sense, it's sort of like convertible with being, right? And so time is like, what is it like? Um, what is it? I think duration totally defectible or something along those lines. So like it's sort of like equivalent to like being itself in some sense, and time is like, okay, being that like has this like sort of like in a way like kind of like defects, right, has beginning and end sort of idea, and that kind of like, okay, that causes, you can use that to sort of like measure change now. Because like it seems to me like Calov actually has like, I guess I was trying to look through it, how the analytics define it. Sort of like, I guess the analytics would say like yeah, sort of like an absolute theory of time, but he would say like time's not like this uncreated substance, like some of, I guess, what Mullins would say, I guess. So I found that kind of very interesting. It was like sort of like the things themselves that sort of like brought about time. I guess I could explain it more, but like I found that kind of really interesting, because he has this view that like because either that you have that view or you have this purely relational view of what time
Mhm.
is. So like you can't what, how do you say this, like so essentially it's like it's, time is not like reducible to like anything, but it's like, these series of moments of like befores and afters. And like I guess the way how Caleb defines time, it's not that either. So I found that like really interesting. Like I haven't really found like, I mean, there's probably some view that's probably similar to it, maybe with temporal parts, but I haven't really found something that like is equivalent to actually Kalov's view on what time is. And I think probably Sammy probably knows this more than me, but there's probably someone who doesn't have like a similar view on what Kalov has on his view of like space, right? And I guess also picking back on that, um, in terms of like, I guess, positive sort of like medical insights in his thought. Like if we talk about metaphysics, other things I thought were really interesting was his like Kalov's like delving into like what truth is, and like his distinction between act and potency, which I thought was really interesting, because he looks like he's building up from what Luther said in the Heidelberg disputation. We can talk about that if we want, but I thought those two as well
Yeah.
was pretty interesting. So
Well,
as far as I read so far, okay,
I
you
don't know if
guys
this
can go.
I don't know if this is a little bit like of an off comment remark to make, but one of the things that I was just thinking about, like as you were talking right now, namely just about like the differences between how different philosophers and theologians conceive of certain categories. I think another benefit in engaging more with our own Orthodox tradition, and particularly with their philosophical literature, is that it actually helps us to appreciate the differences between our theologians. Because I think oftentimes we kind of assume that like all of our theologians agree on a certain topic, when that's actually not the case entirely in terms of the nuances. And what makes you think about this is I was just reading Kenneth Appold, his dissertation on Calov's Doctrine of Vocatio, and he remarks about Preuss's like post-Reformation Lutheran dogmatics. He says that like one of the problems that he found with Preuss and his analysis of the different dogmaticians is that like he often overlooked like subtle differences in their philosophies and just kind of assumed theological consensus because they were using the same terms. And I think that was an easy mistake for Preuss to make, because he was more of a theologian than a philosopher. So, like as a, as a kind of synodical president and as a theologian, like I think the Lutheran theologians were in much agreement, but I think it took somebody like Kenneth Appold, who's more like philosophically astute, to recognize that like, oh, there's actually subtle differences in the way that like, Calov, defines theology versus Gerhard. And that was kind of overlooked by somebody who's only viewing the literature from like a confessional standpoint. So yes, sorry if that was like totally off topic, but as you were just kind of mentioning right now, how like something as simple as like defining time, that can kind of like be different within different theologians. I think that this is in like engaging our own Orthodox tradition, because it would be interesting to see like where our own theologians kind of diverge a little bit, like in speculative matters, so that we could actually compare and contrast like which models do we think are the most successful and the most compatible maybe with like our modern day of science, so on and so forth. But I feel like that kind of speaks for itself.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with you. Like Preuss, like he had this tendency, and it's not a bad, not necessarily like the worst tendency, right? To like let's harmonize all of the dogmaticians together, right? But like but yeah, no, if you actually study, like even if you read like Calov, right, there are like places where he like explicitly, oh yeah, like say like Schleber says this, I don't agree with him. Here's this proof on like why he's wrong or something like that. I think this is like when he's talking about like absolute and respective, which is like absolute in relation is the best way you can think about it. But yeah, no, or like sometimes where like Calov like points out, oh yeah, Shafarius says this, and Schleber disagrees with him, and he says this. Okay, this is how I can sort of like reconcile the two. And he was my third notion. Like,
right, or even like the example that I was thinking of is Kenneth Appold. He kind of treats like the nature of theology in the beginning of his monograph, and he notes that for Calov actually takes a unique position in that he defines theology as the habit of communicating the truths of faith. So like someone like Gerhard, I believe in his his Prolegomena, for him it's like the habit of understanding the truths of faith. But Calov actually kind of has a distinctive conceptualization of like what is theology. So that's just an example of like minor differences that would be interesting to actually parse out and see, okay, where do these guys differ? But if you're just kind of glossing over them and not like paying attention to like the philosophical subtleties, you might miss some of these discrepancies in terms of like how they philosophically construct certain ideas.
Yeah, I was actually going to add on top of that, sort of like an extreme example, but like you mentioned, Luther at Heidelberg and Calov. Where would you say like they're like, Luther's obviously a very, very extreme example, like very, obviously scholastically trained, but that isn't typically the way he approaches these issues. So like where would you say some of like the major differences between like an extreme example like Luther and like a hyper precise, hyper scholasticized, example like Calov? Like where would you say that like what are some of the major differences to word it more precisely that you see between them, and where are some of the points where you actually see intersection? Because you actually made it sound like you actually thought that maybe Calov actually agreed with certain points that Luther made on like reason and theology.
Well, I guess I was, to be fair, I was thinking of like Calov was building on Luther, on what Luther said on like the absolute potency of God, with absolute potency being in God and whatnot. So like the act potency distinction is what I was. To be fair, I was thinking like Calv was like building upon from Luther, from Heidelberg. Sorry about that. I guess because I guess I've read like there's this paper by Eric Phillips who was talking about like the philosophical theses on the Heidelberg disputation in Luther. And like I was reading that, and what Luther was saying there seemed kind of like agreeable to what Calov was doing in like his section on act and potency. That was the main thing. I mean, I know because I haven't actually read the. Well, I guess I technically did, but it's been a while. But like the full, like I guess the original Heidelberg disputation, right, and the I guess the theological theses. It's been a while. But I guess let me try to see here. I guess in terms of like just speaking broadly now, in terms of how they view, let's say Aristotle, right? Right, because Luther just, at least in Heidelberg, let's put it this way, he didn't really like Aristotle at all. But like the thing is though, is like if you read Luther in Heidelberg, like Aristotle, I mean like Luther loved like the Platonists, right? Like Augustine, Plato, who is a Pythagoras, right? So he has a much more so like people like tend to view like Luther, right, as just like all like anti-philosophy, anti-scholasticism, right? But he likes he likes he likes Platonic philosophy, at least their metaphysics, right? And like he sort of has this he was trained in the like the nominalist tradition, right? So he has like this appreciation like for Occam, right? And the nominalist school and their use of logic. And the way I guess going back now to like Calov and how let's say he kind of going like how he sort of like approaches things. Uh, First off, right, he's not as critical of Aristotle as Luther is. But to be fair though, like Caleb does say like, oh yeah, on like divine matters, don't like Aristotle like erred. So don't like don't treat Aristotle as like infallible, which to like some reform bros or like some like papists, right? They'll be like, no, you can't do that. Aristotle wasn't, but like but yeah, no. So I guess in terms of that, like in terms of like disposition toward Aristotle, like Calov had this much more appreciation to him, even though he had some like criticisms of the philosopher. But I guess also, I guess in terms of like approach to philosophy in general, I kind of do view it as sort of how do I phrase this? Because he is influenced by Schleber, and I think Schleber is probably also like this from what I've read about him. Is that I kind of tend to view Calv as sort of like taking okay, you have like the school of nominalism, and you have like you have really cool logic, right? And I kind of want to use their logic and their like oh yeah, they're sort of like how they kind of conceptualize things, but also like like these Platonic ideas are also really cool. So I kind of tended to view like how at least for a little bit, and I probably should like read Suarez if he's sort of like this too. But I tended to view Calov as sort of like this sort of union of like heaven and earth of like the nominalists and the Platonists in some sense. I'm taking the best of both, hopefully, right? So hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that actually I think was very helpful. But yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah. So, man, I've had a lot of fun with this discussion. This certainly isn't going to be the last one we have with you Oilers people. You ever want to come on, you just contact us, discuss anything with respect to this. So I think something the audience is going to be really interested in. Is there a way that they can access the Calov translations that you've made?
What? I don't actually know. Let's see. They're on your Discord server, I guess. Right? I guess. I mean, I don't mind you. Like, I guess I don't know. Like, yeah, I should think about that. I like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I can ask you for help on this. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
if
I
you
mean, like, depending on how open you are to it, like, we can might be able to kind of like share them on the Scholastic Lutherans Twitter page, or just kind of find other platforms to just let people know about these resources that are out there now.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I just really want to make one clarification. The most of the stuff I translated so far, it's still unedited. I still need to edit it. I had like even I was reading Nostology recently, and I noticed like it translated a word notice, but it should be like notitia, so it's like knowledge. So like stuff like that. So I want to like edit everything first. I don't know. I guess I can I guess I don't mind if you can post it there, but just as a quick clarification, there's probably errors in it. If it doesn't make sense, it's probably a typo of some type, or it's like missing something. Just as FYI.
Yeah, no, totally your prerogative. I didn't mean to kind of put you on the spot there. That's what it sounded like. But yeah, you can talk to us, later about these things. But for sure, we'd be willing to help however you want to go about that.
Yeah, we could even add patch updates. Just like okay, this will be 2.1.
Oh well, and we release them to patrons sooner.
Yeah,
Well, I thought I would also comment that I think Cameron had a really good point earlier. The final thing I should say is that Cameron mentioned that we have to talk about this agreement with reason and theology, and I always agree with reason and theology. I am a huge Michael Lofton fan. Yeah, I'm really nuanced and how do I say turbo charitable. Anyway, though, so thanks so much for coming on. Does anybody have any final thoughts?
No, but just thank you, Euler's Pupil, again, like Jared said, for taking the time to let us know about Calov and some of his kind of biographical details and introducing us to his works and some of his thought. And I hope that this is encouraging for people out there to take advantage of our own kind of scholastic Orthodox tradition, because there's so much to offer. And like we discussed a little bit at the end, there's much utility to gain from this area in our tradition and its applicability to today. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you actually are, like, I think, legitimately doing the Lord's work on this sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very, very important. I think especially, during this era where I would say the Roman Catholic tradition is very interested in resurrecting their scholastic tradition, and the Reformed certainly are. The Anglicans, which they kind of don't have a scholastic tradition, but they sometimes want to act like they do. But I'm not trying to create a turf war here, but
somebody clip it.
Overall, the point is that I think that we were kind of late to the game, and I think that we're catching up probably quicker than you would expect. And I think it's thanks to things like this, right? And that's pretty good. I'm very pleased at this. And I think Calov is probably one of the better ones to translate, because he, has a lot to say both on philosophy and theology. And I think that both of those questions, both of those fields are the sorts of things that are just interesting people nowadays. Like, even secularists, a lot of them are just interested in like what Aquinas says or whatever. And bringing up like the fact that we have our own Aquinas essentially, it's actually kind of cool, and so good for you. I mean, this is great stuff.
Yeah, I guess I want to comment on like a few things. Like, I guess the first thing I want to comment, right? I guess actually translating Calov would actually be like a very like hard thing to do. It's like translating like Alsted, like some of these Protestant scholastics, because Calov likes to use a lot of Greek words, technical words interspersed with his Latin sometimes. And then even sometimes there, you're like, oh yeah, here's like this word from like Aramaic or Hebrew. And you're just thinking to yourself, okay, why are you doing this? And like, it's not just him. It's like Alsted's sort of similar to this
just
as well.
just subtly flex, just occasionally. Like,
Yeah.
I know this word, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, it's like when people write English works and they're constantly using Latin. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of like that, right? So instead of like, English works, oh, here's some Latin to be like more sophisticated, right? And be precise, maybe. It's like, oh yeah, here's Latin, but it's like, here's some Greek words, right? To be more, precise and sophisticated, right? But besides that though, going back on yes, like I guess, yeah, personally for me, like I started translating Calov because I guess apparently like no one else sort of was, and I realized no one else doesn't seem like conceivably for a while is going to be starting to translate Calov, and it's like, oh wow, I want to figure out how to translate, stuff from Latin into English. And I tried to learn Latin. I don't think I actually learned it that well, to be honest. But like, I guess to be fair, because I do have a math background on this, and I actually learned about like AI translations first, actually from like a friend of mine who was also in math, but he did a lot of stuff with machine learning essentially. And he was saying, oh yeah, because he was doing this thing where he was trying to like teach this AI to write like a Jane Austen novel essentially, or write like Jane Austen. And I was, oh yeah, he could get like pretty close actually. It turns out if you could do that. But he was saying like, yeah, no, like AI is like actually pretty good at translations, and that's sort of how I heard about like this, idea you can use AI to start translating. So like, props to him. So yeah, so I guess because of it wasn't going to be translated, it's like, oh yeah, I guess I'll just do it since I have the free time, I guess, since I'm while I'm not working on something particular for like my work. But yeah, anything else I want to say? I think that'll be it for now. Sorry. I'm okay with any questions. I'm free all tonight.
Unfortunately, I'm not, but there haven't been too many in the chat, and I think we can always relay them to you, and we could, maybe have like somebody sends emails and we read them off or something one day. So
it's true.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining us. Thanks everybody for watching, and all those who comment later. This was great.
All right, peace.
Peace.
Great.